The goblet shattered against the marble floor before anyone understood why Ilara Voss had gone so still. Duke Alaric Thornwood's laugh rang across the banquet hall, sharp and confident, the kind of laugh that expected an audience and always received one. 50 guests turned toward the high table where he stood, wine in hand, his eyes fixed on the woman seated at the far end near the musicians. She had said nothing wrong. She had said nothing at all. That was precisely his point. "She can't understand Latin," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear, his smirk widening as he gestured toward her with his cup. "Look at her. She doesn't even know what the professor just quoted. Why do we pretend otherwise?" The professor in question, a thin, nervous man named Cedric Barlow, had only moments earlier recited a line from an old philosophical text as a toast to learning, a custom at these royal gatherings meant to honor the scholars invited to dine among nobility. It was a small tradition, harmless, meant to flatter the guild of scholars seated near the king. No one expected a merchant's daughter, newly married into a lesser noble house, to understand a single word of it. Ilara did not answer right away. She let her hand rest flat against the table, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingers, and she counted her breaths the way she had been taught to do since she was a girl of 9, sitting cross-legged on a dusty floor, while a forgotten old man traced letters into the dirt with a stick. The silence stretched long enough for people to notice it. Lady Margaret Fenwick, seated beside her, touched her arm gently. "You don't have to respond to that," she whispered. "I know," Ilara said quietly. "I'm choosing not to yet." Across the hall, the Duke was already turning back to his companions, satisfied that his joke had landed, that the room had laughed with him rather than at him, that the merchant's daughter would sit there red-faced and humiliated for the rest of the evening as she always did whenever he chose to remind everyone where she came from. He did this often. It amused him. It cost him nothing. What he did not know, what almost no one in that hall knew, was that Ilara Voss had read more Latin by the age of 15 than most of the scholars seated near the king would read in their lifetimes. She had learned to hide it the way other people learn to hide a scar. Her father, Edmund Voss, had been a cloth merchant of modest success, respected in his trade but never invited to noble tables, never given a title, never granted the kind of standing that made a man's opinions matter beyond his own shop. He had wanted more for his daughter, not wealth exactly, but something quieter and harder to take away: knowledge. He believed, in his plain and stubborn way, that a mind well trained could survive any collapse of fortune, any change in circumstance, any cruelty the world decided to hand out. So when a strange old man named Aldous Gray arrived in their town nearly destitute, having once served as a translator in the royal library before some scandal no one fully understood forced him into disgrace, Edmund Voss offered him a room above the shop in exchange for teaching his daughter to read. It was meant to be simple: reading, writing, perhaps some arithmetic for the family accounts. It became something else entirely. Aldous Gray recognized within the first few months that the girl sitting across from him at the small wooden table was not merely capable. She was rare. She absorbed language the way dry soil absorbs rain, quickly, completely, without waste. By the time she was 12, she had moved past simple grammar into translation. By 14, she was reading texts that Aldous himself had once struggled with as a young man training for the Royal Library. By 16, she understood not just the words but the arguments beneath them, the philosophy, the reasoning, the subtle traps that old writers set for careless readers. "You must never let anyone see the full extent of this," Aldous told her one evening, his voice low, his hands folded on the table between them. "Not because you should be ashamed. Never that. But because the world is not ready to see a merchant's daughter outthink the men who believe intelligence belongs only to them." "That seems unfair," young Ilara had said. "It is unfair," Aldous agreed. "Unfair things are still true things. Knowing this will protect you longer than fighting it." She had carried that lesson for years, long after Aldous Gray grew too old to teach and moved to a small cottage at the edge of town, long after her father passed and left her the shop, Long after a marriage arranged more out of practicality than affection brought her into the orbit of minor nobility, where she was tolerated rather than welcomed, watched rather than seen. She had learned to let people underestimate her. It made rooms safer. It made comments like the Duke's easier to endure because she always knew something they didn't. She knew the shape of the trap before it closed. She knew, more than anything, that patience was a kind of power that nobody could take from her because nobody else understood its value. But patience was not the same as forgetting. She watched the Duke settle back into his seat, laughing again with the men beside him, refilling his cup as though the moment had already ended, as though his cruelty carried no weight beyond the second it took to speak it. He had done this to her 3 times now in as many months, always at gatherings like this one, always in front of people whose opinions mattered to the court, always with that same smirk that suggested he found her presence at these tables a kind of joke the nobility had been forced to tolerate. Lady Margaret leaned close again. "He does this because he can," she murmured, "because no one has ever made him stop." "Someone will," Elara said. "You sound very certain." "I am." Margaret studied her for a moment, something flickering behind her eyes, curiosity perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. She had known Elara for nearly a year now, ever since the marriage brought her into this circle of half-interested nobles and overly proud scholars, and in that year she had noticed things that others overlooked. The way Elara's eyes moved quickly over documents left open on tables. The way she sometimes mouthed words silently when scrolls were read aloud in languages she was not supposed to know. The way she never asked anyone to translate anything for her, not once, not even when it would have been the easiest and most natural thing to do. Margaret had begun to suspect something. She had never asked directly. Some suspicions felt too important to test with a question that might close a door rather than open one. The banquet continued around them, the noise of conversation and laughter and clinking cups filling the hall as though nothing significant had happened, as though a woman had not just been mocked in front of 50 witnesses for a deficiency she did not actually possess. Servants moved between tables with trays of roasted meat and spiced wine. Musicians in the corner played something light and forgettable. The king, seated at the head table with his advisors, seemed not to have noticed the exchange at all, or perhaps had noticed and simply did not care, since such small cruelties among the nobility were common enough to pass without royal attention. Elara ate slowly, tasting little of what was placed in front of her, her mind already moving elsewhere, already turning over the shape of what would come next. She was not angry in the way people expected anger to look, no flushed cheeks, no trembling hands, no sharp words rising to her lips. Her anger lived somewhere quieter and more durable than that. It lived in the part of her that remembered every lesson Aldous Gray had ever given her, every late night spent translating dense passages by candlelight until her eyes ached, every sacrifice her father had made to give her an education that history and circumstance said she should never have received. She thought of her father now briefly, the way she often did in moments like this. Edmund Voss had died 3 winters ago, quietly in his sleep, the same way he had lived without complaint, without demanding recognition for the small, quiet ways he had shaped his daughter's future. He had never lived to see whether his gamble would matter. He had never known whether the strange old translator he brought into their home would change anything at all, or whether his daughter's education would simply remain a private comfort, invisible to the world, useful only to herself. Elara intended to make certain it mattered. Not tonight. Tonight was not the moment. The Duke's comment, cruel as it was, had been delivered in passing, a small joke tossed off between sips of wine, easily forgotten by everyone except the woman it targeted. If she responded now, in this setting, it would look like defensiveness, like wounded pride lashing out. It would prove nothing except that she could be provoked. She needed a setting where the stakes were clear to everyone watching. She needed an audience that understood what was being tested, scholars who would recognize immediately the difference between luck and genuine skill, nobles who could not later claim the moment had been staged or exaggerated. She needed, more than anything, for the Duke himself to be the one who created that setting, to hand her the opportunity without realizing what he was actually offering. She had a feeling he would. Men like Alaric Thornwood rarely knew when to stop pulling a thread that was slowly unraveling something far larger than they understood. Across the hall, as if summoned by her very thoughts, the Duke rose from his seat again, his cup still half full, his voice carrying easily over the surrounding conversation. "Professor Barlow," he called out, addressing the nervous scholar who had recited the earlier toast. "Tell me, does the Guild still hold its formal gathering this month, the one where you all gather to prove to each other how clever you are?" Barlow straightened, clearly uncertain whether this was mockery aimed at him or simply idle conversation. "Yes, my lord, in 4 days' time, the king has agreed to attend the opening remarks." "Wonderful," the Duke said, his eyes drifting, almost carelessly, toward Alara's end of the table. "Perhaps our merchant's daughter should attend as well. It might do her some good to sit among real scholars for once." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearby tables. Alara kept her expression calm, her hands still, her breathing even. "I would be honored to attend," she said simply, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without seeming to seek attention. "If Professor Barlow does not object to the company." Barlow blinked, clearly startled to be addressed directly, clearly unprepared for the sudden shift of focus onto himself. "Of course not," he stammered. "Any who wish to observe are welcome." The Duke's smirk returned, satisfied, certain that he had arranged nothing more than another small humiliation for later. A woman sitting silently among scholars while topics beyond her understanding floated past her like water past a stone. Alara said nothing further. She simply returned to her meal, her expression unreadable, while beside her Lady Margaret Fenwick watched with growing curiosity, sensing that something had just been set into motion that the Duke himself could not yet see. 4 days, Alara thought. 4 days to prepare for a moment she had already been preparing for since she was 9 years old, sitting on a dusty floor, tracing unfamiliar letters with careful, determined fingers, while an old, disgraced translator watched her work and quietly began to understand exactly what he had found. The banquet stretched on into the evening, but for Alara Voss it had already ended. Somewhere behind her calm expression, a plan was beginning to take shape, patient and precise, built from years of preparation that no one at that table, least of all the Duke, could possibly imagine. The morning after the banquet, Alara rose before dawn and walked the narrow path leading out of town toward the cottage where Aldous Gray had spent his final years teaching her everything he knew. He had passed away 2 winters past, but she still visited the small stone house sometimes, now occupied by a quiet widow named Beatrice Wren who had been kind enough to preserve the old scholar's modest collection of books rather than sell them off for scrap parchment, as many might have done. Beatrice opened the door before Alara even knocked, as though she had been expecting the visit. "You have that look about you again," she said, stepping aside to let her in. "The one you had the week before your father passed, when you already knew something the rest of us hadn't guessed yet." "I need to see his old papers," Alara said, "the ones about the philosophical texts. Anything relating to the Guild's traditional passages." Beatrice led her to the small back room where dozens of scrolls and bound manuscripts sat stacked along wooden shelves, dust gathering in corners that had not been touched in years. Alara ran her fingers along the spines of familiar books, texts she had studied a decade earlier under candlelight while her father slept above the shop, unaware of how deeply his daughter's education had grown beyond simple reading and writing. She found what she was looking for near the bottom of the 3rd shelf, a slim volume with a cracked leather cover, its pages yellowed with age. Aldous Gray had once told her this particular text was among the most frequently quoted at royal gatherings, a collection of philosophical reflections written centuries earlier by a scholar whose name had become almost a symbol of intellectual achievement among the educated classes. Nobles quoted it to sound wise. Scholars debated its meaning to sound serious. And almost no one, Aldous had once confided with a rare flash of amusement, had actually read the original text carefully enough to notice its flaws. "There is an error," he had told her once years ago, tapping a specific passage with one thin finger. A transcription mistake made generations ago by a careless copyist. Everyone since has repeated it without question, because everyone assumes the earlier scholars must have gotten it right. No one checks. No one dares check, because checking would mean admitting that men far more celebrated than themselves might have been wrong. At the time, young Alara had found this fascinating rather than useful, a curious footnote in a much larger education. She had not imagined, back then, that this single detail might someday matter beyond the walls of a quiet cottage. Now she understood exactly why Aldous had chosen to share it with her. She spent the entire morning reading through the passage again, comparing it against her memory of the original source material, checking every phrase against what she recalled of the grammar and syntax typical of that historical period. By midday, she was certain. The error was real, subtle enough that only someone who had studied the original language deeply, rather than simply memorizing translated summaries, would ever notice it. It was, she realized, precisely the kind of mistake the Duke's mockery had assumed she could never catch, which made it, in a strange and satisfying way, the perfect answer to give him. Beatrice brought her tea as she worked, setting the cup down without interrupting her concentration, understanding somehow that this quiet young woman poring over ancient scrolls was engaged in something far more significant than casual scholarship. When Alara finally looked up, the light outside had shifted well past noon. "You found something," Beatrice said. It was not a question. "I have," Alara answered. "Something that has been sitting quietly for a very long time, waiting for someone to notice it. And you intend to be the one who does." "I intend to be the one who says it out loud." Beatrice smiled, a slow and knowing expression. "Aldous always said you would surprise people someday. He used to worry that you'd never get the chance, hidden away in a merchant's shop, married off before anyone understood what you were capable of." "He was wrong about one thing," Alara said, closing the old volume carefully. "I was never hidden, I was waiting." She returned to town that afternoon with the passage committed fully to memory, along with the historical reasoning behind the original error, and the corrected translation that followed from a more careful reading of the source. She spent the following 2 days quietly reviewing everything she knew, cross-referencing details with other texts Aldous had left behind, making absolutely certain that, when the moment came, there would be no room for doubt. No gap in her reasoning that anyone could exploit to dismiss her conclusion as coincidence or guesswork. On the second evening, Lady Margaret Fenwick arrived unannounced at her door, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet concern. "You've been distant these past days," Margaret said, settling into a chair near the small fireplace. "Ever since the banquet, people are starting to talk." "Let them talk," Alara said, though not unkindly. "The Duke has been telling everyone that you accepted his challenge to attend the guild gathering. He seems rather pleased with himself. I think he believes you'll simply sit quietly and prove his point for him." "He believes many things," Alara said, "most of them convenient." Margaret studied her for a long moment, the firelight flickering across her face. "You know something, don't you? Something about the gathering or the texts they'll discuss, or Latin itself. I've suspected it for months, ever since I noticed how you read documents left open on tables, how your eyes move too quickly for someone who supposedly can't understand what's written." Alara said nothing, neither confirming nor denying, though something in her expression must have shifted, because Margaret leaned forward with sudden intensity. "I won't tell anyone," Margaret said quickly, "whatever it is. I only want to understand why you've let people believe otherwise for so long." "Because belief is easier to survive than truth," Alara said quietly. "For a long time, letting people underestimate me was safer than letting them see clearly. My father understood that. My teacher understood it even better. It was never about hiding for its own sake. It was about choosing when the truth would matter most, rather than spending it carelessly on people who wouldn't value it. And now the moment has come to spend it." Margaret sat back, absorbing this, a slow smile spreading across her face. The Duke has no idea what he's walking into, does he? None whatsoever, Alara said. He assumes silence means emptiness. He has never once considered that silence might simply mean patience. Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. I have known you a year, and I confess I never guessed the extent of it. What else are you hiding, Alara Voss? Only what needs to remain hidden a little longer, Alara said, though her eyes carried a warmth that suggested trust rather than secrecy. But I will tell you this much. 4 days from now, at the Guild's gathering, something is going to happen that the Duke cannot undo. He has spent months mocking me in front of people whose opinions matter to him. He has never once stopped to consider that mockery, repeated often enough, eventually creates its own trap. A trap you intend to close on him. A trap he built for himself, Alara corrected gently. I am merely going to be standing there when it finally closes. The two women talked long into the evening, the fire slowly burning down to embers, and by the time Margaret finally rose to leave, she carried with her a growing sense that the world of the royal court, so certain of its own hierarchies and assumptions, was about to be quietly and irrevocably rearranged. Elsewhere in the city, unaware of the quiet preparations unfolding in a modest home near the merchant quarter, Duke Alaric Thornwood spent those same days in far less careful pursuits. He dined with allies, boasted of his upcoming demonstration at the guild gathering, and spoke often of how amusing it would be to watch a merchant's daughter squirm among real scholars. What he did not know, and could not have imagined, was that his own reputation rested on thinner ground than he realized. The Duke's scholarly credentials, much admired at court, had been built largely on inherited titles and second-hand knowledge rather than genuine study. He quoted texts he had never fully read, relying on summaries prepared by tutors and secretaries, presenting borrowed insight as his own understanding. It was a common enough practice among certain nobles, one that rarely faced scrutiny, since few dared question a duke's intelligence to his face. He had chosen, without realizing it, to stage his mockery of Alara Voss in precisely the arena where his own weaknesses were most exposed. Scholarship, careful reading. The kind of deep, patient study that could not be faked or purchased, only earned through years of quiet dedication. Professor Cedric Barlow, meanwhile, spent the days before the gathering in a state of mild anxiety entirely unrelated to Alara Voss. As the scholar responsible for selecting the ceremonial passage to be discussed at the guild's opening remarks, he had chosen, almost by habit, the same well-known philosophical text that had been used at similar gatherings for years, the very text Aldous Gray had once identified as containing a centuries-old transcription error. Barlow had no reason to suspect anything unusual about his choice. It was traditional, it was respected. It had never once, in all the years it had been quoted at royal gatherings, been publicly challenged. He could not have known that this time would be different. As the 4th day approached, the great hall of the guild was prepared for its formal gathering, banners raised, seating arranged according to rank and reputation, scrolls and texts laid out with ceremonial care. The king himself planned to attend the opening remarks, a mark of significance that ensured every noble and scholar in the city would take the event seriously. Alara spent her final evening before the gathering in quiet reflection, reviewing her memory of the passage one last time, considering carefully how she would present her findings when the moment came. She thought of her father, of Aldous Gray, of every quiet sacrifice that had led her to this point. She thought, too, of the Duke's smirking face at the banquet, the casual cruelty of a man who had never once considered that the woman he mocked might understand more about the world, and about himself, than he could possibly imagine. Tomorrow, she thought, watching the last light fade from her window, the silence I have carried for so long will finally speak for itself. She slept soundly that night, untroubled by doubt, certain in a way that only years of quiet preparation could make a person certain. And when morning came, she rose ready to walk into a hall full of scholars who believed they already knew exactly what to expect from her. The guild hall stood at the heart of the city, a building older than most of the noble houses that now looked down upon it, its stone walls lined with portraits of scholars long dead, its high windows filtering pale morning light across rows of wooden benches arranged in careful order of rank. By the time Alara arrived, the hall was already filling with people, the low murmur of conversation rising toward the vaulted ceiling like smoke gathering before it finds an opening to escape through. She wore a simple gray dress, unadorned, deliberately plain among the silks and jewels of the surrounding nobility. She had considered, briefly, dressing to impress, choosing something that might command attention before she ever spoke a word. She had decided against it. Let them underestimate the dress as they underestimated everything else about her. It would only make what followed more striking by contrast. Lady Margaret Fenwick met her near the entrance, her own expression carefully composed, though her eyes carried a flicker of excitement she could not fully hide. "The whole court is here," she whispered as they found their seats. "Even Countess Sinclair came, and she rarely attends anything that doesn't involve music or dancing." "She'll find this more interesting than she expects," Alara said quietly. Near the front of the hall, King Edwin took his seat upon a raised platform, flanked by Bishop Alden Croft and several senior advisors, his presence transforming what might have been a routine scholarly gathering into an event of genuine significance. The king rarely attended guild functions, and his decision to do so this year had already generated considerable talk among the nobility, talk that only intensified once word spread of the Duke's public challenge to a merchant's daughter. Professor Cedric Barlow stood near the ceremonial podium, shuffling through his notes with visible nervousness, occasionally glancing toward the growing crowd as though still unable to believe how much attention his simple selection of a traditional passage had managed to attract. Duke Alaric Thornwood arrived last, as he often did, ensuring that his entrance would draw every eye in the hall. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own place in the world, greeting nobles with practiced charm, exchanging brief words with Lord Percival Hale before taking his seat near the front, close enough to the king's platform to be seen by everyone present. He caught sight of Alara across the hall and offered a small, mocking nod, as though welcoming a guest to a party she had not been properly invited to. The gathering began with formal ceremony, greetings exchanged between the king and the guild's senior scholars, brief remarks about the importance of learning and the preservation of knowledge across generations. Bishop Croft offered a short blessing, his voice deep and measured, calling upon divine wisdom to guide the discussions that would follow. Alara listened patiently, her hands folded in her lap, aware that the true purpose of the gathering, at least as far as she and the Duke were concerned, had not yet arrived. It came shortly after, when Professor Barlow stepped forward to introduce the ceremonial passage that would open the day's scholarly discussions. "As is tradition," Barlow began, his voice steadying somewhat now that the moment had finally come, "we begin with a reflection upon wisdom and virtue, drawn from the philosophical writings long honored by this guild. This passage has guided scholarly discourse for generations, and it remains, I believe, as relevant today as it was when first written." He began to recite the Latin text, his pronunciation careful and deliberate, the ancient words filling the hall with a solemn weight that seemed to still even the restless murmur of the crowd. Alara listened closely, following every word, confirming silently that the transcription error Aldous Gray had identified so many years ago remained exactly where she expected it, unnoticed and unchallenged, just as it had been for generations before. When Barlow finished, a ripple of quiet approval moved through the hall, scholars nodding at the familiar words, nobles murmuring appreciatively as though understanding had nothing to do with actually following the meaning and everything to do with recognizing the performance of wisdom. It was then that Duke Alaric Thornwood rose from his seat. "A beautiful passage, Professor," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, drawing attention exactly as he intended. "Though I wonder how many here truly understand its meaning, rather than simply admiring its sound." A few scattered laughs greeted this remark, though most of the hall waited, sensing that something more significant was about to unfold. The Duke turned, slowly and deliberately, toward the section of the hall where Alara sat beside Lady Margaret. I recall a conversation at the recent banquet, he continued, in which I suggested that our newest addition to noble circles might struggle with such texts. She was kind enough to accept an invitation to attend today's gathering. Perhaps now would be an excellent opportunity to test that claim properly, in front of witnesses whose judgment cannot be disputed. The hall fell silent, dozens of eyes turning toward Elara, curiosity and amusement mingling on the faces of nobles who had heard rumors of the earlier exchange, but had not witnessed it firsthand. King Edwin, seated upon his raised platform, leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but attentive. Bishop Croft exchanged a brief glance with Lord Percival Hale, both men clearly uncertain whether this exchange constituted harmless court entertainment or something considerably more pointed. "My lady," the Duke continued, addressing Elara directly now, his smirk fully in place, confident and unhurried, "would you honor us by offering your own translation of the passage Professor Barlow has just recited? I understand it may prove difficult, but I am certain the Guild would appreciate the attempt." Professor Barlow, standing near the podium, shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to navigate a moment that had shifted so abruptly from ceremonial tradition into something resembling public spectacle. He glanced toward the king, silently seeking guidance, but Edwin offered only a small, curious nod, apparently willing to let the exchange continue. Lady Margaret placed a hand briefly on Elara's arm, a silent gesture of support, though her eyes carried a flicker of nervous energy rather than concern, as though she suspected, more than anyone else in the hall, exactly what was about to happen. Elara rose slowly from her seat, allowing the silence to stretch a moment longer before she spoke, giving the hall time to fully absorb the weight of the challenge that had just been issued in front of the king, the bishop, and every scholar of consequence in the city. "I would be glad to offer my understanding of the passage," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the quiet hall without need for raised volume. "Though I should mention, before I begin, that my understanding may differ somewhat from the translation Professor Barlow has just presented." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion mingling with curiosity. Professor Barlow's brow furrowed, his earlier nervousness deepening into something closer to genuine concern. "Differ?" the Duke repeated, his smirk faltering slightly, though he quickly recovered his composure, clearly assuming this to be nothing more than a desperate attempt to obscure an inability to translate the passage at all. "In what way could your understanding differ from a text this guild has recited for generations?" "In the way that matters most," Elara said, "which is accuracy." The word landed heavily in the silent hall. Somewhere near the front, Countess Adelaide Sinclair leaned forward in her seat, her earlier boredom replaced entirely by sharp attention. Lord Percival Hale exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Bishop Croft. Even King Edwin, seated upon his raised platform, straightened slightly, his curiosity now unmistakable. "Perhaps," Elara continued, her tone measured and respectful rather than confrontational, "it would be best if I simply demonstrated what I mean, rather than describing it. If Professor Barlow would be willing to recite the passage once more, slowly, I believe the Guild will understand my meaning far more clearly than any explanation I could offer beforehand." Barlow, still uncertain but unwilling to refuse such a direct and reasonable request in front of the king, glanced down at his notes and began again, his voice slower this time, more deliberate, each Latin phrase given careful weight and space. The hall waited in near total silence, the earlier murmur of amusement replaced by something closer to genuine anticipation. Duke Alaric Thornwood remained standing, his earlier confidence now shadowed by the faintest trace of uncertainty, though he masked it well, folding his arms and offering a small, expectant smile toward Elara, as though still fully convinced that whatever followed would only confirm his original mockery rather than dismantle it. He had no way of knowing, standing there in the quiet hall beneath the king's watchful gaze, that he had just handed Elara Voss precisely the opportunity she had spent the last 4 days, and in truth the last 15 years, quietly preparing for. As Professor Barlow finished his slow, careful recitation for the second time, the hall held its breath collectively, dozens of scholars and nobles waiting to see whether the merchant's daughter would falter under the weight of expectation, or whether something else entirely was about to unfold in front of the assembled court. Elara drew a slow, steady breath, feeling the familiar calm settle over her, the same calm she had felt as a girl tracing unfamiliar letters in the dirt. The same calm Aldous Gray had once told her would carry her through moments exactly like this one, when the world finally demanded proof of what she had spent her entire life quietly building. "Thank you, Professor," she said softly. "Now, if I may, allow me to show you what generations of scholars have overlooked." She stepped forward, away from her seat, moving into the open space near the podium where every eye in the hall could follow her without obstruction. It was a deliberate choice. She wanted no doubt afterward about what had been said, no possibility of later claims that her words had been misheard or exaggerated by those sympathetic to her. "The passage Professor Barlow has recited," she began, "speaks of wisdom as something that grows quietly within a person over time, like a tree whose roots deepen long before its branches ever reach toward the sky. This is the translation that has been passed down through this guild for generations, and it is, in most respects, a faithful rendering of a beautiful idea." She paused, letting the familiar words settle over the hall once more. "But there is a single word within that passage, a word so small it has been overlooked by scholar after scholar for longer than any of us in this room have been alive, and that word changes the meaning of the entire reflection." The hall remained utterly silent. Even the restless shifting of fabric and the quiet creak of wooden benches seemed to still. "The word in question," Elara continued, "was originally written to describe wisdom not as something that grows on its own, quietly and passively, the way roots deepen without effort. It was written to describe wisdom as something that must be tended, deliberately and continuously, the way a gardener tends roots that would otherwise wither without care. The difference between these two words in the original language is small. A single letter shifted through careless copying centuries ago by a scribe who likely never noticed the error he had made. But the meaning that difference creates is not small at all." She turned, addressing the hall more broadly now, her voice steady and unhurried. "Consider what this means. The passage as it has been recited for generations suggests that wisdom arrives naturally, inevitably, given enough time, regardless of effort. It is a comforting idea, but it is not what the original author intended to say. The corrected reading tells us something far more demanding, and I believe far more true. Wisdom does not simply grow on its own. It must be cultivated deliberately, protected, given attention, or it withers just as surely as any garden left untended. The original scholar was not describing patience alone. He was describing responsibility." A murmur began to spread through the hall, scholars turning toward one another, whispering, some already reaching for the scrolls and reference texts they had brought with them, eager to verify what they had just heard. Professor Barlow stood frozen near the podium, his face pale, his earlier nervousness now replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. "That cannot be correct," he said, though his voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. "This translation has been used for generations. Surely such an error would have been noticed long before now." "With respect, Professor," Elara said gently, "that is precisely how errors like this survive. Not because no one is clever enough to notice them, but because everyone assumes someone else already has. Each generation trusts the generation before it, and so the mistake is copied forward, unquestioned, simply because questioning it would mean suggesting that scholars far more celebrated than ourselves might have been wrong." She turned to face Barlow directly, her tone softening, careful not to humiliate the man who had, after all, done nothing more than follow a tradition inherited from those who came before him. "You are not at fault for repeating what generations of respected scholars believe to be accurate. But if you examine the original manuscript housed in the Royal Archive, rather than the copied transcriptions used in ceremonial recitations, I believe you will find the letter I have described, faded but still legible. exactly where I have said it would be. A quiet gasp moved through parts of the hall. Lord Percival Hale leaned toward Bishop Croft, whispering something urgent. Countess Adelaide Sinclair sat perfectly still, her earlier restlessness entirely forgotten, watching Alara with an expression that mixed disbelief and something close to admiration. King Edwin, seated upon his raised platform, remained silent for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly between Alara and the stunned face of Duke Alaric Thornwood, who stood frozen near the front of the hall, his earlier smirk entirely gone, replaced by an expression of dawning, uncomfortable realization. "You claim," the king said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that immediately silenced every whisper in the hall, that a text quoted at royal gatherings for generations contains an error that has gone unnoticed by every scholar who has studied it before you. "I do not claim it lightly, your majesty," Alara said, turning to face him directly, her posture respectful but unshaken. "I would not have spoken had I not been certain. I was taught many years ago that a claim of this weight requires more than confidence. It requires proof that can withstand scrutiny from those most eager to disprove it. And you have such proof." "I have my knowledge of the original language, gathered over many years of careful study. I have the reasoning I have just shared with this hall, which any scholar present is welcome to examine and challenge. And I would ask, respectfully, that the Royal Archive's original manuscript be consulted, so that my claim might be verified beyond doubt, rather than accepted merely on the strength of my word alone." A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled scholars at this suggestion. It was, several of them murmured to one another, exactly the kind of rigorous approach one would expect from a truly serious scholar, an insistence on verification rather than simple assertion, a willingness to be proven wrong rather than a demand to be believed without question. Bishop Croft rose slowly from his seat near the king. "Your Majesty, if I may, the Royal Archive does hold the original manuscript from which this ceremonial passage was first transcribed. It would be a simple matter to send for it and examine the passage in question before this very gathering." King Edwin considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving once more toward Duke Thornwood, whose face had gone from pale to faintly flushed, the weight of dozens of watching eyes clearly beginning to press upon him. "Send for it," the king said finally. "Let us settle this matter with evidence rather than opinion." A young attendant was dispatched immediately, hurrying from the hall toward the Royal Archive situated only a short distance away. In the time it took for him to return, the hall filled with a low, constant murmur of conversation, scholars debating quietly among themselves, nobles exchanging glances heavy with speculation, everyone present aware that something significant was unfolding, though few yet understood exactly how significant it would prove to be. Duke Alaric Thornwood remained standing near the front of the hall throughout this interval, unwilling to sit, unable quite to leave, caught in a kind of frozen discomfort as the moment he had engineered slipped further and further from his control. He had expected humiliation to flow in one direction only. He had never once considered that the current might reverse itself so swiftly, and so completely, in front of the very audience he had assembled to witness his triumph. Alara remained standing as well, calm and composed, her hands folded in front of her, waiting patiently for the proof that would either confirm or dismantle everything she had just said. She felt no anxiety in the waiting. She had known, from the moment she first found the correct passage in Aldous Gray's old cottage, exactly what the archive would reveal. The only uncertainty left in the room belonged entirely to those who had spent their lives assuming the tradition they inherited could never be wrong. When the attendant finally returned, breathless from hurrying, carrying a fragile and ancient scroll cradled carefully in both arms, the entire hall fell silent once more, watching as Bishop Croft accepted the manuscript and began, with visible care, to unroll it upon a cleared table near the king's platform. Bishop Croft leaned over the ancient scroll, his eyes moving carefully across faded ink that had survived centuries of careful preservation, his lips moving slightly as he traced the unfamiliar script with one finger. The hall waited in absolute stillness, the kind of silence that seems to press against the ears, heavy and expectant. "Here," the bishop said finally, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the silence. The letter she described, faded as she said it would be but unmistakably present. He straightened, looking first toward the king, then toward the assembled hall, his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who has just witnessed something he did not expect to witness. The passage as recited today, and as recited at every guild gathering within living memory, does indeed contain the transcription error the Lady Voss has described. The original manuscript supports her reading entirely. The silence that followed this announcement was unlike anything that had come before it in the hall that day. It was not the anticipatory silence of a crowd waiting to see what would happen next. It was the heavier, more disorienting silence of a room full of people forced simultaneously to reconsider something they had never once thought to question. Professor Cedric Barlow sat down slowly, almost collapsing into his chair near the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the ancient manuscript now displayed openly before the king. He had built a portion of his scholarly reputation on his mastery of exactly this kind of ceremonial recitation, on his careful, practiced delivery of texts precisely as tradition demanded. To learn now, in front of the king and the entire guild, that the tradition itself had carried an error for generations, was a blow he had not prepared himself to absorb. He was not alone in this discomfort. Scattered throughout the hall, other scholars shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some staring down at their own hands, others exchanging quick, uneasy glances with colleagues who had spent years quoting the same flawed passage in lectures, sermons, and formal writings, never once suspecting that a merchant's daughter, seated quietly among them for the first time, would be the one to finally notice what centuries of careful study had somehow missed. Lord Percival Hale, who had once written an entire treatise praising the ceremonial passage's reflection on the natural, effortless growth of wisdom, sat rigid in his seat, his face carefully neutral, though those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw, the recognition that his own published work now rested on a foundation considerably less solid than he had believed. Countess Adelaide Sinclair, who had never pretended much interest in scholarly matters, found herself nonetheless leaning forward with genuine fascination, watching the unfolding reactions around her with the sharp attention of someone witnessing a shift in the court's hierarchy that would likely be discussed at every gathering for months to come. "This is remarkable," she murmured to the noblewoman seated beside her. "I have never seen this hall so thoroughly silenced." Duke Alaric Thornwood, meanwhile, stood frozen near the front of the assembly, his earlier confidence entirely drained from his posture, his face carrying an expression somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. He had orchestrated this entire moment believing it would end in Alara's humiliation, staged carefully in front of the king, and the full weight of the guild's scholarly reputation. Instead, he now stood as the man who had publicly, confidently, and repeatedly mocked the very person who had just corrected centuries of scholarly error in front of the highest authority in the kingdom. He opened his mouth once, as though to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words adequate to the moment. The smirk that had defined his presence at the earlier banquet, the casual, confident cruelty that had cost him nothing before, had vanished entirely, replaced by the uncomfortable stiffness of a man watching his own carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. King Edwin rose slowly from his platform, moving to stand beside Bishop Croft near the ancient manuscript, examining the faded script himself for a long, quiet moment before turning to address the hall. "In all my years attending this guild's gatherings," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine consideration rather than performance, "I have never witnessed a correction of this significance made so clearly and defended with such careful reasoning. Lady Voss has not merely claimed an error existed. She has shown us precisely where it lies, explained why it has persisted so long, and provided the means to verify her claim beyond any reasonable doubt." He turned to face Alara directly, his expression thoughtful. "Where did you acquire such mastery of a language most scholars spend their entire careers attempting to fully understand?" Alara considered her answer carefully before speaking, aware that this question, more than any other asked that day, would shape how the court understood everything that had just occurred. "I was taught by a man named Aldous Gray," she said, "who once served this very archive as a royal translator. Many years before circumstances I never fully understood led to his quiet departure from that position. He recognized, when I was still a child, that I possessed an unusual capacity for language, and he chose to nurture that capacity rather than allow it to go unused simply because I was a merchant's daughter rather than a nobleman's son." A quiet murmur moved through the hall at the mention of Aldous Gray's name. Several older scholars exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the name from years past, though none spoke openly of whatever scandal had once forced his departure from royal service. "He believed," Alara continued, "that knowledge should not be reserved only for those born into circumstances that made its pursuit convenient. He believed that talent, wherever it appeared, deserved cultivation rather than dismissal. I have spent 15 years honoring that belief, studying quietly without seeking recognition, because recognition was never the purpose. Understanding was the purpose." King Edwin studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his expression, a kind of respect that had not been present when the gathering began. "And yet today, you have chosen recognition after all." "Today," Alara said, "recognition was necessary, not for myself, but for the truth this guild has unknowingly misrepresented for generations. I would have remained content to keep my knowledge private indefinitely, had circumstances not required otherwise. But an error of this magnitude, once identified, cannot be left uncorrected simply to preserve anyone's comfort, including my own." The king nodded slowly, then turned his attention toward Duke Thornwood, who still stood frozen near the front of the hall, visibly struggling to find any words that might restore even a fraction of his earlier composure. "Duke Thornwood," Edwin said, his tone carrying a subtle edge that had not been present in his address to Alara, "you arranged this demonstration yourself, if I recall correctly, confident that it would expose an inability rather than reveal an oversight generations in the making. Do you have anything to say regarding what has just transpired?" The Duke's throat worked visibly before he managed to speak. "I had no knowledge of any such error, Your Majesty. I assumed, as did everyone present, that the traditional passage was accurate." "That much is clear," the king said, his voice carrying just enough dryness to draw a few quiet, nervous laughs from scattered corners of the hall. "What is equally clear is that your confidence in mocking the Lady Voss's understanding was considerably less well-founded than your confidence in your own." The Duke said nothing further, his silence more damning than any response he might have offered. Around him, the hall's attention had shifted almost entirely away from him, drawn instead toward Alara, who stood quietly near the podium, her expression calm despite the weight of dozens of eyes now regarding her with an entirely different quality of interest than they had carried only an hour earlier. Lady Margaret Fenwick, watching from her seat, felt a slow smile spread across her face, one she made no attempt to hide. She had suspected, for months now, that there was more to her quiet friend than the court had ever bothered to notice. She had not imagined the reveal would arrive with quite this much force, quite this much undeniable clarity, in front of the king himself. Professor Barlow rose slowly from his seat, moving toward Alara with an expression that mixed embarrassment and genuine curiosity. "Lady Voss," he said quietly, "I confess I do not know whether to thank you or apologize to you. Perhaps both are warranted." "Neither is necessary, Professor," Alara said gently. "You inherited a tradition in good faith, as scholars before you did. The fault, if fault must be assigned, belongs to centuries of careless copying, not to any single person's failure to notice what generations before them also failed to notice." Barlow nodded slowly, though the troubled expression did not entirely leave his face. "Still, I would very much like to understand how you came to recognize what so many others missed. If you would permit it, I would value the opportunity to discuss this further, scholar to scholar." The words seemed to catch in the air, drawing quiet attention from those nearby who had overheard them. Scholar to scholar. It was a phrase that would have seemed unthinkable only hours earlier, offered now without hesitation by a man who had, until this very morning, likely never once considered that a merchant's daughter might deserve such a title. Elara inclined her head slightly. "I would welcome that conversation, Professor." Across the hall, the whispers had already begun to spread, carried from bench to bench, from noble to noble, the story of what had happened growing more remarkable with each retelling, before the gathering had even fully ended. By evening, Elara knew, the tale would reach every corner of the city, shifting quietly and irreversibly the way the court understood her, the way it understood the Duke, and perhaps, in some small but lasting way, the way it understood what intelligence truly looked like, and where it might be found. Duke Alaric Thornwood remained in the hall long after most of the crowd had begun to disperse, standing motionless near the front, staring at the ancient manuscript still displayed upon the table, as though hoping the faded ink might somehow rearrange itself back into the comfortable certainty he had carried into the gathering that morning. It did not, of course. Some truths, once revealed, could not be persuaded back into hiding. By the following morning, the story of what had happened at the Guild Hall had already spread through every level of the city, from the servants' quarters of the royal palace to the merchant stalls in the marketplace where Elara's father had once sold his cloth. Versions of the tale multiplied and shifted with each retelling, some exaggerating details, others softening them, but the essential truth remained constant in every version. A merchant's daughter, mocked publicly by a duke, had corrected a centuries-old scholarly error in front of the king himself. Duke Alaric Thornwood spent that first day in a state of simmering humiliation, unable to appear at court without catching whispered conversations that fell silent the moment he drew near, unable to walk through familiar halls without noticing glances exchanged behind his back. He had built his standing at court carefully over many years, cultivating an image of refined intelligence and casual authority. That image now felt fragile in a way it never had before, and the fragility itself infuriated him more than the original humiliation. He could not simply accept what had happened. Men like Thornwood rarely could. Rather than allow the matter to fade quietly, as it might have done with time, he chose instead to escalate it, convincing himself that if he could somehow discredit the source of his humiliation, he might yet salvage something of his damaged reputation. 2 days after the guild gathering, he requested an audience with the king, presenting himself with careful composure, his earlier panic replaced by a calculated strategy he believed would restore his standing. "Your Majesty," he began, once granted his audience, "I have given considerable thought to the events at the recent guild gathering, and I confess I harbor certain doubts I feel obligated to share." King Edwin regarded him with an expression that carried more patience than warmth. "Doubts regarding what precisely?" "The Lady Voss claims to have been taught by a former royal translator, a man named Aldous Gray, whose departure from royal service occurred under circumstances I understand were never fully explained to the public. I wonder, Your Majesty, whether her knowledge was truly earned through years of careful study, as she claims, or whether it was perhaps acquired through less legitimate means. Perhaps assistance from someone else entirely, someone eager to see the nobility embarrassed." It was a calculated accusation, vague enough to avoid outright slander while still casting doubt on the legitimacy of Elara's achievement. The king's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what motivated the duke's sudden concern for scholarly integrity. "That is a serious suggestion, Duke Thornwood," Edwin said slowly, "one that would require considerably more than vague speculation to support. I ask only that the matter be properly investigated, Your Majesty, for the integrity of this guild and for the honor of scholarship itself." Word of the Duke's accusation reached Elara before the day's end, carried swiftly by Lady Margaret, who arrived at her door with visible frustration evident in every line of her posture. "He's questioning whether your knowledge is even real," Margaret said, pacing near the small fireplace. "Suggesting you may have had help, or worse, implying you somehow deceived the entire hall. After everything you demonstrated in front of the king himself. I expected something like this, Alara said, her voice calm despite the accusation's weight. Men who lose control of a moment rarely accept the loss gracefully. He cannot undo what happened in that hall, so he seeks instead to undermine the foundation beneath it. What will you do? Exactly what I would have done regardless of his accusations. I will provide proof, clear enough that no reasonable person could continue to doubt it. The following morning, Alara traveled once more to the small cottage at the edge of town, where Beatrice Wren still cared for the modest collection of books and papers Aldous Gray had left behind. She explained the situation carefully, and Beatrice, her expression hardening with quiet indignation on Alara's behalf, led her immediately to a locked chest tucked beneath the floorboards of the back room. Aldous kept journals, Beatrice said, lifting the chest's lid to reveal neat stacks of worn notebooks, their pages filled with careful, precise handwriting. Records of his teaching, notes on his students' progress, observations he made throughout the years he tutored you. He was meticulous about such things, a habit from his years in royal service, I imagine. He always said proper documentation mattered, that a scholar's claims meant little without evidence to support them. Alara sat on the floor of the small room, exactly as she had done as a child so many years earlier, and began carefully reading through the journals, page after page documenting her progress from the age of 9, through her early struggles with basic grammar, through the gradual and unmistakable development of genuine fluency, culminating in detailed notes from her later years describing her ability to identify subtle errors in transcribed texts, including, she noted with quiet satisfaction, a specific entry describing the very transcription error she had revealed at the guild gathering, dated nearly a decade earlier. He knew, she murmured, staring at the entry. He knew exactly what I would eventually be capable of proving. He always believed in you, Beatrice said softly, long before the rest of the world had any reason to. Armed with these journals, along with Beatrice's willingness to testify formally regarding the years of tutoring she had witnessed firsthand, while sharing the small cottage with Aldous Gray during his final years, Alara requested her own audience with the king. She was granted one within the day, the matter having attracted enough attention at court that Edwin seemed genuinely eager to see it properly resolved. She arrived carrying the small chest of journals herself, refusing offers of assistance from servants, insisting on presenting the evidence with her own hands. Duke Thornwood was present as well, summoned to hear whatever response Alara intended to offer, his expression carefully composed though the tension in his shoulders betrayed a lingering unease that had not been present during his earlier confident accusation. "Your Majesty," Alara began, setting the small chest upon the table before the king, "the Duke has suggested that my knowledge may not be genuinely earned, that perhaps I received assistance in deceiving the guild. I understand why such a suggestion might seem reasonable to someone unfamiliar with the years of quiet study that preceded that gathering. I have brought evidence to address this concern directly." She opened the chest and began presenting the journals one by one, allowing Bishop Croft, present as an impartial scholarly witness, to examine the handwriting and confirm its age and consistency. Beatrice Wren, called forward as well, offered her testimony regarding the years she had witnessed Aldous Gray's careful, patient tutoring, describing the countless evenings she had observed him working with a determined young student long before that student ever imagined standing before a king. "These journals," Bishop Croft said, after examining several entries carefully, "appear entirely genuine, Your Majesty. The ink and parchment show consistent age, the handwriting remains uniform throughout, showing no signs of recent forgery. Moreover, this entry here," he said, pointing to the page Alara had found earlier that morning, "describes the exact transcription error identified at the guild gathering, dated nearly 10 years before that event took place." A murmur moved through the small, gathered audience at this revelation. King Edwin examined the entry himself, his expression thoughtful as he compared the aged handwriting against the more recent portions of the journal. "This entry alone," the king said slowly, would be difficult to fabricate after the fact, given its age and the specificity of its content. It suggests strongly that Lady Voss's knowledge of this error long predates any possible motive to deceive this guild. He turned toward Duke Thornwood, his expression carrying a weight that had not been present at their earlier private audience. Duke Thornwood, do you still maintain your doubts regarding the legitimacy of Lady Voss's education? The Duke hesitated, clearly aware that any further insistence would only deepen the damage already done to his own standing. I withdraw my concerns, Your Majesty. It appears the Lady Voss's knowledge was indeed genuinely earned. It appears, Edwin said, his tone carrying a subtle edge, that your concerns were considerably less about scholarly integrity than about salvaging your own reputation following a humiliation you brought entirely upon yourself. The Duke said nothing, his silence once again more telling than any words he might have offered. As the audience concluded and the small gathering began to disperse, Bishop Croft approached Alara quietly, his expression carrying genuine warmth rather than the cautious neutrality he had maintained throughout the proceedings. I would like to examine these journals further, if you would permit it, he said. Not to question their legitimacy, which I believe is now beyond doubt, but because they contain observations about language and translation that I suspect this guild would benefit greatly from studying. I would be honored, Bishop Croft, Alara said. Aldous Gray spent his life believing that knowledge should be shared rather than hoarded. I imagine he would have welcomed exactly this outcome. Word of the audience's conclusion spread through the court just as quickly as news of the original guild gathering had, and this time, the story carried with it not just admiration for Alara's demonstrated skill, but genuine sympathy for the years of quiet dedication that had made that skill possible, alongside a growing recognition of how thin the Duke's own scholarly reputation had proven to be beneath its confident surface. For the first time since the banquet where his mockery had first been spoken aloud, Duke Alaric Thornwood found himself the subject of court gossip not for his wit or his standing, but for the desperate and ultimately futile attempt to discredit a woman whose only offense had been proving him wrong in front of witnesses he could not silence. In the weeks that followed, the court's perception of Alara Voss shifted in ways that surprised even those who had witnessed the guild gathering firsthand. Invitations began arriving at her small home with increasing frequency. No longer the polite but distant courtesies extended to a merchant's daughter tolerated among nobility, but genuine requests for her presence at gatherings where scholarly discussion formed the primary purpose of the evening. Professor Barlow proved true to his word, visiting her twice in the first month alone, arriving each time with questions about specific passages he had long taken for granted, eager to understand the deeper reasoning behind translations he had recited for years, without fully examining their foundations. Their conversations, initially formal and somewhat awkward given the circumstances of their first true exchange, gradually settled into something resembling genuine friendship, built upon mutual respect for careful, patient scholarship. I have spent 20 years reciting texts I never fully understood, he admitted during one such visit, sitting across from her at the same small table where she had once studied under Aldous Gray's careful guidance. It is a humbling thing to realize how much of what I believed I knew was simply inherited assumption rather than genuine understanding. It is a common enough failing, Alara said gently. Most scholarship builds upon what came before it, trusting the foundation without always testing its strength. The error was not yours alone to bear. It belonged to generations of scholars who all made the same reasonable assumption. Perhaps, Barlow said, but you did not make that assumption. You tested the foundation yourself, rather than trusting it simply because everyone before you had. Bishop Croft, too, became a regular presence in her modest home, arriving with questions about Aldous Gray's journals, seeking her guidance on translation matters that touched upon religious texts as well as philosophical ones. Their conversations often stretched late into the evening, candles burning low as they debated the subtle meanings hidden within centuries-old manuscripts. the bishop increasingly impressed by the depth of understanding she brought to questions that had puzzled far more celebrated scholars for years. Lady Margaret Fenwick, delighted by her friend's growing recognition, took particular pleasure in accompanying Alara to the gatherings now extended to her, watching with quiet satisfaction as nobles who had once barely acknowledged her presence now sought her opinion on matters ranging from literature to philosophy to the proper interpretation of ancient legal texts. "You've become quite fashionable," Margaret observed one evening, as they walked together toward yet another gathering of the Guild's senior scholars. "Countess Sinclair mentioned you twice this week alone, always with considerable admiration." "Fashion fades quickly," Alara said. "I would rather be valued for what I actually know than admired for how interesting my story happens to be at the moment." "Perhaps," Margaret said, "but there is no reason it cannot be both, at least for now. Enjoy it a little, Alara. You have earned far more than mere tolerance from this court." Not everyone at court embraced this shift with equal grace. Some nobles, uncomfortable with the notion that genuine intellect might exist outside the boundaries of noble birth, continued to regard Alara with quiet suspicion, whispering among themselves that her success was merely a fortunate accident, a single lucky discovery rather than evidence of sustained scholarly ability. These whispers grew quieter, however, as Alara continued to demonstrate her knowledge in gathering after gathering, offering careful, well-reasoned insights on texts ranging far beyond the single passage that had first brought her recognition. Duke Alaric Thornwood, meanwhile, found himself facing an entirely different kind of scrutiny in the months following the Guild gathering. His earlier attempt to discredit Alara's education, followed by its public and thorough failure, had drawn unwelcome attention to his own scholarly credentials, which several curious members of the Guild now began quietly examining with considerably more rigor than they had ever applied before. It did not take long for uncomfortable questions to emerge. The Duke's celebrated understanding of classical texts, it turned out, relied heavily upon summaries prepared by a small staff of tutors and secretaries, individuals whose names rarely appeared alongside the Duke's own confident public pronouncements. Several scholars, emboldened perhaps by the precedent Alara had set in questioning long-accepted assumptions, began quietly comparing the Duke's public statements against the actual texts. He claimed to have mastered finding discrepancies that suggested a far more superficial understanding than his reputation implied. Lord Percival Hale, who had once counted himself among the Duke's closer allies at court, found himself increasingly distant from Thornwood in the months following the gathering, uncomfortable with the growing whispers regarding the true depth of the Duke's scholarship. Their friendship, built largely upon shared status rather than genuine intellectual respect, cooled noticeably as the Duke's carefully constructed reputation continued to erode beneath quiet but persistent examination. "You should have simply accepted the correction gracefully," Hale told him bluntly during one of their final private conversations. "Instead, you chose to fight a battle you could not win, and in doing so, you drew attention to weaknesses you might otherwise have kept hidden indefinitely." "I could not simply accept public humiliation," Thornwood said, his voice carrying a bitterness that had grown more pronounced with each passing week. "No," Hale agreed, "but you might have accepted a private correction with dignity, rather than a public unraveling brought about entirely by your own refusal to let the matter rest." The Duke had no response to offer. His standing at court, once built upon effortless confidence and casual authority, now rested upon considerably more uncertain ground, undermined not by any single dramatic revelation, but by the slow, steady erosion of trust that follows when a reputation is discovered to be thinner than it once appeared. Alara, for her part, took no particular satisfaction in the Duke's continued difficulties. She had never sought his downfall, only the correction of an error that mattered far beyond any personal grievance between them. When their paths crossed occasionally at larger court gatherings, she offered him the same measured courtesy she extended to every other noble present, neither seeking further confrontation nor indulging in the kind of quiet triumph that might have felt satisfying, but would have served no genuine purpose beyond petty vindication. "You could remind him more often of his error," Margaret suggested once, only half joking. As they observed the Duke from across a crowded hall, his earlier confidence visibly diminished as he navigated conversations with considerably more caution than he once displayed. "I have no need to," Alara said. "The truth has already done that work far more thoroughly than I ever could through repetition." As the months passed, Alara's place within the court's scholarly circles grew increasingly secure, built not upon a single dramatic moment, but upon sustained demonstration of genuine understanding, careful reasoning, and the same patient dedication that had defined her education from its earliest beginnings. She began, with Bishop Croft's encouragement, contributing formally to the Guild's ongoing efforts to review other traditional texts for similar transcription errors. Her expertise increasingly sought after by scholars eager to ensure the accuracy of knowledge they had once accepted without question. Professor Barlow, in particular, became an enthusiastic advocate for a broader review of the Guild's ceremonial texts, arguing before the assembled scholars that the error Alara had identified likely represented only one among many similar mistakes accumulated across centuries of careful but imperfect transcription. "If we are to call ourselves scholars in truth," he argued during one particularly spirited gathering, "we owe it to the knowledge we claim to preserve to examine it as rigorously as Lady Voss examined this single passage, rather than trusting inherited assumptions simply because it arrives wrapped in tradition." The proposal, initially met with some resistance from scholars uncomfortable with the implied criticism of generations past, gradually gained support as more members of the Guild came to appreciate the value of the rigorous approach Alara had demonstrated. Within the year, a small formal committee had been established to review the Guild's most frequently cited texts, with Alara herself invited to serve as a founding member, an honor that would have seemed entirely unthinkable to the court only months earlier. She accepted the invitation with quiet gratitude, aware that this recognition represented something considerably larger than personal vindication. It represented, in its own modest way, a small but meaningful shift in how the court understood the relationship between birth and intellect, between inherited privilege and genuinely earned knowledge, a shift that Aldous Gray had believed possible long before anyone else had reason to imagine it. Nearly a year after the banquet where Duke Alaric Thornwood first mocked her in front of the assembled court, Alara Voss stood once more in the great hall of the Guild, though this time the occasion carried none of the tension that had defined her first appearance there. The hall had been prepared with even greater ceremony than before, banners freshly hung, benches arranged to accommodate a crowd larger than any Guild gathering in recent memory, drawn by word that the king himself intended to make a formal announcement of considerable significance. Alara wore, on this occasion, a dress of deep blue rather than the plain gray she had chosen for her first appearance among the scholars. It had been a gift from Lady Margaret Fenwick, who had insisted that this particular day called for something befitting the occasion rather than deliberate modesty. "You no longer need to hide behind plainness," Margaret had told her that morning, helping arrange the dress's fine embroidered sleeves. "Let them see you as you truly are, Alara. You have nothing left to prove by appearing smaller than you know yourself to be." The hall filled steadily as the appointed hour approached, nobles and scholars alike finding their seats amid a buzz of anticipation that reminded Alara, in some distant way, of the very gathering where this entire journey had begun. But where that earlier day had carried an undercurrent of mockery and expectation of humiliation, this gathering carried instead a warmth of genuine anticipation, the kind reserved for occasions when something has been earned rather than merely staged. King Edwin arrived flanked by Bishop Croft, both men carrying themselves with the ceremonial dignity befitting a formal royal announcement. Professor Barlow, no longer nervous in the way he had once been, stood near the podium with evident pride, having spent the better part of the year working alongside Alara on the Guild's ongoing review of its ceremonial texts, a collaboration that had already uncovered 2 additional transcription errors beyond the one that first brought them together. The king raised his hand for silence once the hall had settled, and the murmur of conversation faded quickly, replaced by attentive stillness. "Nearly a year ago," Edwin began, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall. "In this very room, a woman many of you knew only as a merchant's daughter demonstrated a depth of scholarly understanding that corrected an error this guild had unknowingly preserved for generations. In the months since, she has continued to demonstrate that understanding was not the product of a single fortunate discovery, but the result of years of genuine, dedicated study she pursued quietly, without recognition, long before circumstance finally brought her knowledge into the light." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the hall before continuing. "It is the tradition of this guild to recognize scholarly contribution through formal honors, granted to those whose work has meaningfully advanced our collective understanding. Today, I am pleased to announce that Lady Elara Voss has been granted the formal title of Royal Scholar of Language, the first such honor awarded outside the ranks of nobility in the history of this guild, in recognition of her contributions to the accuracy and integrity of texts long entrusted to our care." A wave of applause swept through the hall, warm and genuine, scholars and nobles alike rising from their seats to honor the announcement. Lady Margaret, seated near the front, clapped with unrestrained enthusiasm, tears of pride visible in her eyes as she watched her friend receive recognition that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. Elara stepped forward to accept the formal scroll bearing her new title, presented to her personally by the king, her expression carrying quiet composure rather than triumphant display, though something in her eyes suggested the full weight of the moment had not escaped her. "Your Majesty," she said, once the applause had settled enough for her voice to carry clearly, "I accept this honor with deep gratitude, though I must share it with someone who cannot stand here today to receive his own recognition. Aldous Gray, once a translator in this very archive, believed long before anyone else had reason to that knowledge deserved cultivation wherever talent appeared, regardless of the circumstances of birth that surrounded it. Whatever I have accomplished, I owe first to his patient teaching, and to my father, Edmund Voss, whose modest means never once diminished his belief that education could change what fortune alone could not." She looked out across the assembled hall, her gaze moving briefly, deliberately, toward the section where Duke Alaric Thornwood sat, his expression carefully neutral, though considerably more subdued than it had been at their first fateful encounter. "I would also offer a word of gratitude, however unexpected it may seem, to those whose doubt forced me to demonstrate what I had long kept quiet. Sometimes it takes a challenge, even one offered without kindness, to reveal what patience alone might have left hidden indefinitely." A ripple of quiet, appreciative laughter moved through parts of the hall at this remark, though it carried no cruelty, only the gentle acknowledgement of a truth everyone present understood without needing it spelled out further. Duke Thornwood, for his part, rose slowly from his seat as the ceremony neared its conclusion, making his way through the dispersing crowd toward where Elara stood, still surrounded by well-wishers offering their congratulations. The hall quieted somewhat as people noticed his approach, curious what exchange might follow between the two figures whose earlier confrontation had set this entire year of transformation into motion. "Lady Voss," the Duke said, his voice carrying none of the mocking confidence it once held, replaced instead by something closer to genuine, if uncomfortable, humility. "I owe you an apology, one considerably overdue. My conduct toward you, both at the banquet and in the challenge that followed, was unkind and unfounded. I allowed assumption to guide my judgment rather than genuine inquiry, and I compounded that error further by refusing to accept correction gracefully when it was offered." The hall watched in near silence as Elara considered his words, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Apology accepted, Duke Thornwood," she said finally. "I bear you no lasting resentment. What happened between us revealed something considerably larger than either of our personal pride. A reminder that assumptions about who deserves recognition often say more about the one making the assumption than about the person being judged. I hope you have found, in the months since, that humility carries its own kind of wisdom, one perhaps more valuable than the confidence it replaced." The Duke bowed slightly, an unusual gesture from a man of his rank toward someone still, by birth, his social inferior, though few in the hall failed to notice the significance of the moment, a quiet acknowledgment that true standing, in the end, could not be inherited alone. As the gathering finally began to disperse, Lady Margaret found her way to Elara's side, linking arms with her friend as they made their way toward the hall's grand entrance. "How does it feel," Margaret asked, "to finally stand exactly where you always deserved to stand?" Elara considered the question carefully before answering, her gaze drifting briefly toward the ancient portraits lining the hall's high walls, generations of scholars whose reputations had shaped this guild long before her own arrival within it. "It feels," she said finally, "like the beginning of something rather than an ending. My father gave me an education believing it might someday matter, without ever knowing whether it would. Aldous Gray taught me patiently, believing knowledge deserved cultivation regardless of who possessed it. Neither of them lived to see this exact moment, but I carry them with me into it all the same." She paused at the entrance, looking back once more at the great hall behind her, filled now with the quiet murmur of scholars discussing texts and translations with genuine enthusiasm rather than performative display. "I intend to spend whatever years remain to me ensuring that no other quiet, capable mind goes unnoticed simply because it arrived in circumstances the world did not expect to produce brilliance. That, I think, would be the truest honor I could offer to everyone who believed in me before anyone else thought to look." Together, she and Margaret stepped out into the afternoon light, leaving behind a hall transformed as much by quiet persistence as by any single dramatic revelation. A transformation that would continue, in small and lasting ways, long after the memory of a duke's careless smirk had faded entirely from the court's collective memory. Years later, long after the formal title of Royal Scholar of Language had become simply another accepted fact of court life, rather than a novelty anyone remarked upon, Elara Voss found herself once again in a small, humble room, seated across from a child not much older than 9, watching careful, uncertain fingers trace unfamiliar letters into a shallow tray of sand spread across a wooden table. The girl's name was Isolde Marsh, daughter of a blacksmith who lived at the edge of the city, a child whose quick mind had been noticed almost by accident during one of Elara's regular visits to the poorer quarters, where she had established a modest school intended for children whose families could never have afforded formal education under ordinary circumstances. Isolde had been assisting her mother with deliveries that day, waiting outside while her mother spoke with a customer, when she overheard Elara explaining a grammatical concept to another student through the open window, and without any prompting, corrected a small error in the explanation from where she stood outside. Elara had noticed immediately, the way Aldous Gray must once have noticed something similar in her own childhood, the particular quality of attention that separated genuine aptitude from simple curiosity. She had invited Isolde inside that same afternoon, and within a season, the blacksmith's daughter had become one of her most dedicated students, absorbing lessons with the same quiet hunger Elara herself remembered from her own earliest years of study. "You corrected my sentence again," Elara said now, watching Isolde work through a translation exercise with careful concentration, her tongue caught slightly between her teeth in a gesture of focused effort. "You are supposed to tell me gently when I make such errors, not simply fix them and continue as though nothing happened." Isolde looked up, startled, clearly unsure whether she had done something wrong. "I only meant to help," she said quickly. "I did not mean to be disrespectful." "You were not disrespectful," Elara said, smiling. "You were correct. I made the error deliberately to see whether you would notice it. You did, and quickly. That is precisely the skill I hope to cultivate in you, the confidence to trust what you know to be true, even when the person before you holds more authority or experience than you do." The lesson continued for another hour, Elara guiding Isolde through increasingly complex passages, watching with quiet satisfaction as understanding deepened visibly across the girl's expressive face. When the lesson finally concluded and Isolde departed for home, promising to return the following week with her translation exercises completed, Ilara remained alone in the small room for a while longer, reflecting on how naturally this particular pattern had repeated itself. Teacher recognizing student, patient cultivation replacing careless dismissal. The school itself had grown considerably since its modest beginnings, funded partly through her own resources and partly through contributions from an increasingly diverse circle of supporters at court, including, somewhat unexpectedly, occasional donations from Duke Alaric Thornwood himself, who had, in the years following his public humiliation, undertaken a quiet but genuine effort to rebuild his reputation through less superficial means. He had never become close with Ilara in any personal sense, their relationship remaining formal and respectful rather than warm, but he had come to publicly support the very institution built upon the principle that had once so thoroughly embarrassed him, that intelligence recognized no boundary of birth or circumstance. Professor Barlow, now considerably older and more settled in his role as the Guild's senior scholar of classical texts, visited the small school occasionally, delighted to observe children from backgrounds he once would never have considered capable of serious scholarship, demonstrating exactly the kind of careful, rigorous thinking he had spent his career believing belonged exclusively to more privileged circles. "I sometimes wonder," he told Ilara during one such visit, watching a group of young students debate the proper translation of a difficult passage with surprising sophistication, "how much talent this kingdom lost across all the centuries before you decided to seek it out deliberately, rather than waiting for it to announce itself through fortunate accident, as your own did." "More than we will ever know," Ilara said, "which is precisely why we must continue looking, rather than assuming brilliance will always find its own way to the surface without help." Bishop Croft, too, had remained a steady presence in her life, their scholarly collaboration having produced, over the years, a careful revised edition of several ceremonial texts long recited by the Guild, corrected now to reflect accurate translations rather than centuries of accumulated error. The revised texts had been formally adopted throughout the kingdom's religious and academic institutions, a lasting legacy that would likely outlive every person who had witnessed the original controversy that first brought the errors to light. Lady Margaret Fenwick, who had remained Ilara's closest friend and confidant throughout every stage of this transformation, often remarked that she considered herself fortunate to have witnessed, from the very beginning, the quiet unfolding of something she now understood to be historically significant, though at the time it had felt simply like watching a friend finally step into recognition she had always deserved. "Do you ever think about that banquet?" Margaret asked one evening, the two women sharing wine on the small terrace behind Ilara's home, now considerably more comfortable than the modest quarters she had occupied in her earlier years at court. "The moment the Duke first mocked you, and you simply sat there silent, letting him believe he had won something." "Often," Ilara admitted. "Not with anger any longer, though I confess anger was present enough at the time. Mostly I think of it now as the moment I finally understood that patience, properly used, is not weakness. It is simply strength waiting for its correct occasion. And now that the occasion has long since passed, and patience is no longer required in quite the same way, what remains?" Ilara considered the question, watching the evening light settle golden and warm across the rooftops of the city she had grown to know so thoroughly over the years, from its poorest quarters to its grandest halls. "What remains," she said finally, "is the responsibility to make certain that others who carry similar quiet brilliance never have to wait as long as I did, or endure the kind of casual cruelty that so nearly convinced me, in my weaker moments, that hiding was safer than being seen. My father gave me the gift of education without knowing whether the world would ever value it properly. I intend to give that same gift to as many children as I can reach, so that fewer of them ever have to wonder, the way I once did, whether the world will ever notice what they are capable of." The following autumn, the small school Ilara had founded expanded once more, this time with formal recognition and funding from the guild itself, becoming an official institution dedicated to identifying and cultivating scholarly talent among children regardless of their family's standing or wealth. Isolde Marsh, now considerably more advanced in her studies, had begun assisting with the youngest students, demonstrating the same patient dedication toward teaching that Ilara herself had learned so many years earlier from a disgraced translator who believed, against all convention of his time, that knowledge belonged to whoever proved capable of holding it. Duke Alaric Thornwood, attending the school's formal expansion ceremony as one among many notable guests, found himself standing near Ilara as the celebration wound toward its conclusion, the evening light casting long shadows across the newly constructed classrooms. "I have thought often over these years," he said quietly, "about how differently my life might have unfolded had I simply accepted correction gracefully that first day, rather than allowing my pride to demand a battle I could never have won." "Pride rarely allows for such foresight," Ilara said, without unkindness. "It convinces us in the moment that surrender feels worse than the fight that follows. Most people learn this lesson eventually, though few learn it as publicly as you did." The Duke offered a small, rueful smile, the first genuine expression of humor she had seen from him in years. "A humbling lesson, delivered before the entire court, though I confess, looking back, it may have been the most valuable lesson I ever received, however painfully it arrived." Ilara said nothing further, simply nodding once in quiet acknowledgement before turning her attention back toward the children gathered near the school's entrance, their eager voices rising in the evening air as they explored the new classrooms that would soon become the foundation of futures none of them could yet fully imagine. The story that had begun with a careless insult across a crowded banquet hall had grown, in the years since, into something considerably larger than the pride or humiliation of any single person involved. It had become, instead, a quiet but lasting reminder that brilliance recognizes no boundary of birth, that patience properly used can outlast even the most confident cruelty, and that the truest measure of wisdom lies not in where a person comes from, but in what they choose to do once the world finally, undeniably, is forced to see them clearly.